Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming inside on this gorgeous, gorgeous day. I am Kelly Montana, and I am the Assistant Curator here at the Menil Drawing Institute. And thank you all for joining us for our program this afternoon, an artist talk with Marcia Kure. We're so pleased Marcia could travel from New Jersey to be here with us in person. And her conversation today is held in conjunction with her monumental wall drawing titled Network, which is right over here. And I hope many of you have spent the last few months familiarizing yourselves with it. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Cockrell Family Fund for their generous support of our Artist Talk series this year. We began this series in 2018, and we offer to the public through these talks the chance for artists to come here in person, artists that are either have works on view in the museum or are represented in our permanent collection. And to learn more about all the different types of public programming we do, we have everything listed on our website, so I encourage you to take a look. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones if you have not done that already. And we are recording this program, so if you're interested, silence your cell phone, Marcia. And we are recording it today, so it will be available on YouTube probably in the next couple weeks. And we will have a little bit of time after our conversation here for you to ask questions to Marcia, so please hold them until that time. But even more special is after this conversation, we're going to have a little party to celebrate Marcia outside immediately following the conversation. So we'll have music by Heaven Mozart just outside on the deck in the green space, and we'll have food from vendors DB Rapide and El Topo following the program as well. So hope you've built up an appetite. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Marcia Kure. Marcia was born in Nigeria and attended the University of Nsukka for her art degree. She's been a resident at the illustrious Haystack and Skowhegan programs in Maine and currently lives and works in Princeton, New Jersey and Abuja, Kaduna, Nigeria. She is an artist that works across media, often featuring carefully considered natural pigments in her explorations of colonial legacies and diasporic identities. Her work has been exhibited across Africa, Europe, and North America, including the Dakar Biennale in Senegal, the Pompidou in Paris, and the Smithsonian Museum of African Art in DC. And she is the third artist to have graced this wall with a unique, monumental, yet ephemeral drawing. It's really been a true pleasure to live with this work for the past 7 or so months and come into work every day and see it. And my questions and curiosity have only managed to deepen, which I think is a great strength of this work, that it begs immersion and it begs long, close, repeated looking. So it's been such a gift.
Thank you.
And it's particularly generous of you to have me join you today in conversation, because as I said, my questions have just proliferated. And so with that, what I'd actually like to do is I've brought a few images of, I'd like to kind of take us all aback for just a moment and look at the kind of work that Marcia was doing in just a few years before this drawing, so we can get a sense of what her work looks like on a slightly smaller scale and what her work looked like in drawing. So with that, and this is Marcia working on the wall in process here in case no one gathered that. So this is an early iteration you're seeing here. But I want to start with this really quite beautiful work, Marcia. This is in the collection of the British Museum in London. Mm-hmm. And what I would really love to hear from you, well, one, you have your use of natural pigments that you've been engaged with for many years happening in this work. Mm-hmm. But what I'm so taken with in it is the sense of opacity and transparency that you get in these materials, and the sense of kind of formation that this figure is in. Can you speak a little bit about this work?
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for coming out. This was part of a series of drawings that I made for the Paris Triennale. And the opacity and the transparency that you see comes from the natural pigments that I've been working with, but also watercolor. With watercolor, you're able to build layers. You're able to, You're able to build layers. You're able to retain the underlayer and then add onto that, allowing the colors to interact. So for example, if you want to make green, you can put yellow first, and then on top of that you put blue. And then the way the light interacts with it creates green. So you don't necessarily have to mix green on your palette to apply to the watercolor. That way of working with water, with color, you can see translated onto the wall drawing. Is kind of a technique that I use to build narratives, stories, and the way that I also use to connect the past and the present. So it's not necessarily just a technique that I work with in my work, but also the concept, how the concept merges with the technique and the material.
Thank you for that, Marcia. It's just such a gorgeous work. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to also share with everyone that Marcia also works quite extensively in collage, and these are 4 drawings that were on view in Germany. Is that correct? In Europe?
I think Austria.
In Austria.
Yeah.
They were on view in Austria.
Yeah.
And what I'm really taken with and struck by here is, again, you have this sense of hybrid forms, this sense of formation, so many curvilinear lines, but you're doing it through the cut. You're achieving fluidity through cut lines in here, which is so surprising and dynamic.
With collage, a lot of people question me about collage and how I came to collage. And many people would trace, collage through Dada or the Dadaist. There is that aspect of it, but I came to collage to trying to solve a drawing problem. And when I cut, I draw with the blade. I draw around the form to create the kind of shapes that I want. So the cut becomes also very important, going back to my previous method of combining technique, concept, and material in the work. Here, I'm able to place the cut pieces to create movement, something you would also see in the drawing, because for me, drawing and collage are interrelated.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Okay.
And I was also interested in having you speak about this one, because when I came across it, what I was really surprised by is so early in our project together, when we were, when I was learning about your process and you were sharing your work with us, you brought to the Drawing Institute, I guess it was maybe 8, 10, or 12 material studies. So you had saturated paper with different kinds of pigments, and you were just showing what you had been experimenting with. And I saw this, and this seemed like a work where you were also thinking about material saturation. But in this one, I was also struck that the figure starts to go away here. So can you talk about this move into abstraction?
Yeah. The journey to abstraction has been a long one for me. I think I started with abstraction, when I was in college, but I think I was looking for more content in my work, something that I can always pull from. It was fine that I could draw the lines, it was fine that I could abstract something, but what was I trying to say? Where was I trying to build? How do I build my resource that I can pull from to abstract? If you look back at if you think about the first drawing, the figurative drawing you saw, where I was working with natural pigments, there I used the pigments to form the figure. But here, the figure is completely absent. What becomes important is the pigment itself, how the pigment speaks to history, how this pigment speaks to its relationship with the body. Here is colonial pigment, and you're thinking about the cultural significance of kola nut. You're thinking about how it's cultivated. You're thinking about how it's traded. You're thinking about the labor that goes into producing kola nut. The history of kola nut, how it moved from one country to the next, how the different kinds of uses that it has. So, for example, kola nut is not that is used to welcome people. It's a hospitality, symbol of hospitality. It is used for different rites of passage from birth, marriage to death. So here, while the body is absent, it's also present through the use of the pigment. There's so much more history in terms of thinking about kola nut, not just as a pigment, but something conceptual. What that allowed me to do in my work is to think of as pigment as something much more than just color. So if I want to paint a landscape, for example, it's important for me to go into that landscape and collect soil from that landscape and extract pigment from there and use it for the work. It becomes much more significant to me than just using pigment on it that I bought in the store. So pigment becomes conceptual in my work.
Well, I think what's interesting to point out about that statement, and that I think will become particularly powerful when we start talking about the wall drawing, is that it's important to you to move your body across space and move your body to different continents, and for you to physically follow those routes that kola nut also goes on, from harvesting to its end use, whether that be from, again, hospitality or a form of welcoming people. And the last work that I wanted to share with everyone today on this screen is this exhibition that you did in Stockholm. And for this one, we're seeing a lot of Boli figures from Bamana that I believe you make. I know that you modified them with synthetic hair, which that front one we see there with the braids is familiar to us having experienced this wall drawing. But I'd be curious to hear about the thinking behind this project and how you made these sculptures.
Well, in making this sculpture, this installation, I was immersed in thinking about labor, how governments control bodies in return for protection, security. You work, you go to work, you get paid, and in return, the government offers you protection, or that kind of relationship between citizenship and governing bodies. I was also interested in consumption and trade, and pop culture. So here, what I did was think about the Bali figure as something that, of course, has been transported across boundaries, but there's this aspect of it that in the original context of the place where it's from, the Bali figure is both subject and object. It it's a sign of peace. It offers protection to its community. But having been removed or transported across boundaries or sold, there's this aspect of it being commodified. There was also a play on the museum in this, with the glass pedestals. But the way that I combined the consumption and the significance of the Bali figure is to think about them as soft toys, soft power, to think about them as objects that you would want to possess or own, and arrange them in a way where they create like a collection of bodies advancing towards something. The checkerboard pattern on the ground of this particular venue reminded me of chess, like a chess game. So the figures are placed as if they are information of a chess game. And when you think about a chess game, you're thinking about strategies, you're thinking about the way that you move objects from one position to the next. So there's also that play too on the grid, on the system, on a structure that these figures are now being placed on. That was what I was thinking. And the hair was also a take on trade, because these hair extensions are bought from the beauty supply store. They are traded and they're used to beautify the body. And here I attached them to the figures and braided the hair, somehow further abstracting the form itself, where in some cases where you see is just the shape of it, you're not quite sure whether they are, what kind of figures they are. They were made with fabric and stuffed, just like a soft toy. And then on top of that, I either used wax, the hair that you see. Sometimes I use the fabric and plaster of Paris. So I treated them as sculptures too. And in some cases painted on them. But there are some of them where you see kind of created like texture, both on the wax and then the plaster of Paris there, in the little figure at the rear, and sprayed it with spray paint. So there's a combination of all kinds of materials that I used for the work. Did I answer your question, or did I go too far?
No, very much so, very much so. And what I actually didn't know about this project was I didn't know that you were thinking actively about chess, which is so fascinating. Because I'm familiar with bully figures and that they're kind of power figures, and that you're thinking about relationships of power and hierarchies of power in this. But when you use the metaphor of chess, that just got me thinking that there's particular ways that these figures move, right? These invisible lines that kind of connect these figures in a particular way, or that they're ways that they are allowed to move, right?
The ways that they're allowed to move, exactly.
Yeah, and that's I find that really fascinating that there's power but stricture at the same time in this, and also
then who moves the figures as well.
Yeah.
Who is pushing the figures in where they should be.
Certainly.
Too.
And, something like this, the date you made this project in 2019, which is just the year before we started working together with you at the Menil. And so I saw lots of resonances in this project. But what I heard in your description just now, again, is I want to bring it to this idea of these kind of invisible lines that dictate movement. Because, of course, that brings us to your project here, brings us to Network, which I'd love for us to turn to now. So we don't have any images here because it's right here in front of us. But I guess, maybe we'll just start talking about the drawing itself and the ideas of network that are embedded in this. Can you talk about your idea of what the network meant in this piece for you?
I've been thinking about lines quite a bit, especially having lived and worked on 3 different continents, in terms of trying to link my influences and link the countries, link the continents. I mean, when I'm thinking about work, I don't think in the singular, I think in multiples. So for the longest time, I was in a quandary as to how to make these connections between my own past and present. And struggled with it for quite a bit. I kept on seeing, these travel lines, especially when I look at the map of a plane route system. When I'm traveling, and you look at the little booklets they have behind in your seats, and marveled at the fact that from Lagos to New York, for example, was like a line. Got me thinking about how to think about line across space and time, across territory, across geographies. The line became very active, and when I was in the plane traveling, I was actually inside a line. That made me start thinking about line as something that allowed me to perform, allowed me to be involved or embedded in this network or this structure. And it became a question of how to link all these narratives on a picture plane. So I started gathering as many plane routes, routing systems as I could find. And the more that I gathered them, stories began to emerge from trade routes to surveillance routes to fiber optic routes, migratory patterns of birds, bodies being trafficked, there's hardly anything you want to think about that you cannot find a routing system for. So it became a question of how to connect all these lines to create this very complex network that I was thinking about. And because I saw myself in this network, it became something that I could easily relate to in terms of connecting my own story to the network and being embedded inside this network, and found that this network is extremely complex. I'm sorry. It's extremely complex. It's not something I can possibly comprehend as a whole. I can only comprehend parts of it, and only parts of it can unveil itself to me at any given point in time. So it became a question of thinking about line in a very multi-layered way. And I like the fact that I could do it through something as simple as a line. Line for me has been very important. Starting from my studies at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, where I dealt with pictographs, glyphs, a kind of writing system called Uli, and thinking about it just not as something that was placed on the body, but something that could communicate meaning, so that your writing becomes a kind of drawing. You're thinking about scripts, hieroglyphics, writing. When you're angry, is very different from when you're not angry when you sign your signature, for example. So what that tells me is that line can carry more information than we give it credit for. And it just became a way of thinking more expansively and much more deeply about what drawing can be, what drawing means to me, what script means, and how I can combine a form of writing or glyph or routing system with all these ways of mark making. So the mark making emerges from a writing system where I'm writing across the surface of the earth. I'm writing across space and time. I'm inscribing. I'm gouging. I'm making marks on a landscape. So line becomes much more immersive and it's not just the line. It has much more content than that, than just being a line.
And what I've learned about Uli from you is that, we're talking so much about lines and charged lines, but part of what's really prized about Uli is the dynamic between the line and the negative space. It's this kind of interaction, this receptivity between the two. I'm thinking positive and negative, absence and presence, but I'm also thinking about how you see the network as something that reveals itself in facets. It can't be all seen at once. I guess, can you just speak a little bit to this idea of positive and negative and how these spaces inform each other in this drawing?
So in Uli, the negative space is as important as the positive space. I remember when I came to the States, a lot of people found it difficult to see my drawing as complete because sometimes the spaces were all empty and there was just a mark in the middle of it. And I kept on insisting that the negative space makes the positive space possible, without the negative space, you cannot see the positive space. And so, to me, it's not empty, it's charged with meaning. And then, you also think about the concept of ma in Japanese aesthetics, where the silence gives meaning to speech, or the absence of something gives meaning to whatever it is that is present. So it's almost like the same kind of concept where the negative balances the positive, and the negative is actually charged. It's not empty, it's filled with a lot of content. When I think about the network, sometimes I think about neurological, the way that the brain functions and the way that it sends messages from one nerve system to the other, and the gaps that exist between two nerves, and how information is transferred from one nerve to the other. There is information that is being transferred in spaces that are, as far as we know, probably empty, but it allows for that transfer of information. And sometimes that transfer of information is complete, sometimes it's incomplete, sometimes it's excessive, sometimes it's in fragments, so that when that information is transferred, it only transfers in, parts of it, not the whole part. And when it transfers to the next nerve, that nerve kind of creates its own content and its own meaning around that. When you transfer that whole way of thinking into a network, you begin to see how sometimes part of the network is not particularly clear to me. It's not like I can explain the entire network. Sometimes there are parts of it that are clear. Sometimes there are parts of it that are unclear. Sometimes there are transitions that I see the possibility of, but I don't know how it came about. I know that there is a connection, but I cannot explain to you how there is a connection. So the way that I think about the network doesn't mean that it's complete and that I don't understand everything. I don't. I can only see parts of it, and that's part of the reason why the lines kind of push out of the drawing. It's like it extends beyond the wall. It continues beyond the wall. So when you combine that way of thinking with the network, then you begin to have all these other ways of thinking about a network.
Certainly. Well, in hearing you talk about how important it is how revelatory it was for you for the line to become something embedded, mm-hmm. and that when you see this, you almost sort of see this infinite space. You mm-hmm. see these lines as this is just a parcel or a facet of this larger phenomenon that you're speaking to. And when you describe it in that way, it's very clear to me that this drawing was always going to be multidimensional in your head. There was never any question, even though it came later for us to discover that that's what it was going to be. But that was so instrumental to how you think about drawing, that it really, that this was an opportunity to really expand it out from the wall in that way. Mm-hmm. So I think the last question I would like to ask you today is how that comes to be a network, and that we have these two sculptures that are placed on a platform and atop pedestals that have been modified by you with synthetic hair. Mm-hmm. And these are sculptures that were purchased from marketplaces that deal in these goods. Mm-hmm. And I guess the phrase that's always stuck with me about them is that, well, one, you wanted them to be in this project because they are subject and object, as you put it, with the bully figures. They have their figures and stories in and of themselves, but they're also figures that move in this network. And that you wanted to place the hair upon them to beautify and protect them. And then you've extended them onto a stanchion, which is an object typically used for security, to wayfind, right, to move people through spaces. So it's just with all of these thoughts, can you kind of respond to that sense of protection, beautification, and that this drawing is becoming multiple dimensions?
I remember when I thought about adding the sculptural elements to the drawing, and there was that whole thinking about, oh, it's three-dimensional, the drawing is two-dimensional, how does a sculpture become a drawing? And I think at this point, drawing has evolved to such a very sophisticated level. When you think about drawing, you think about the origin of things. You begin to think about the beginning of something. You think about it as a stem cell. It's a thought, it's a script, it's a way of transferring that first thought onto paper. It's a mark that you make, is to say, I was here. You think about drawing and you think about cave drawings. You think about the way that it just encompasses you, and that whole idea of it being something that tells you that someone is present. So it's the way of like making your presence known, making a thought known, expressing that first sketch, that first idea on paper. So that goes all the way back to linking drawing with writing. And when you think about that, and you think about the way networks are formed, the way that things are encompassed, making sculpture also begins with that initial thought or idea. For me, sculpting is using clay to draw. I see everything from the point of drawing. I've always done that. So combining the sculptures with the drawing was not something I struggled with. It was something that just came naturally. Placing these objects in the drawing spoke to this network that I've been referring to, where these objects, sometimes extracted from the continent and ripped of their clothing, extracted from the continent and then placed in museums. So, of course, with the stanchions, the pedestals, I'm making references to museum studies. I'm making references to how these objects were taken and placed in an institution. So there's that going on in the work as well. You can tell from the stanchions, these are things that you see. This is like museum language, if you will. Buying them from a place where they were they're being traded. I bought one online and then one in Texas. A lot of people came thinking that these were from the collection. So that plays into this whole aspect of making things for the tourist market, making things for trade, making things that for commercial reasons. And these are supposed to be like objects that were revered. And now they're in this commercial system of trade and exchange. So I saw the figures as both, like I did with the Boli figure, object and subject. And you think about the network and trading system and how bodies were traded. So there's also that connection to, with the 3 continents that I'm trying to link, with the drawing, with the trade systems that I'm trying to connect to, immersing my own self and my own narrative into this network, and kind of implicating everyone in the network. I mean, you move from here to your house, you're in a network, in my way of thinking. You are participating willingly or not in a global network. You are drawing a line.
Yeah, and that sense of implication, I think, really comes across in the immersive quality of it. That this drawing, it recedes, it pushes forward, and then with these figures that are inviting and confrontational, really ask those questions of us. Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you, Kelly.
And with that, I'd love to turn it over to you all. We have a microphone that will be coming around, so if you have any questions for Marcia, please raise your hand. And Tony, we have a question.
Hello, how you doing? Thank you so much for bringing this beautiful display to the Menil collection and allowing us to participate. A quick question. I noticed the color brown is a very dominant color in the piece. Is there a reason for that, especially given how you describe the network and it being almost this array of like kind of different, sounds like feelings and kind of concepts, but it seems like there's one kind of dominant kind of hue you're using, so just curious why that and if there's a reason for that. Thank you.
So the color comes from natural pigments. The brown that you see is from kola nut. The color was extracted from the kola nut. The blue you see is indigo. And that too, implicated in a trade network system. And the history of kola, the history of indigo they're both heavy in terms of labor, agriculture, migrating bodies, capital. So it's another way of touching on all these issues by way of the pigment, by way of extracting this pigment, just like the way resources are being extracted from the earth, but then using that concept to extract the pigment and then applying it to the work. It also allows the work to have a certain kind of tone. When you mix the reds and the blues, you get this kind of gray color. You get different kinds of tones, actually. And you're able to cover quite a large spectrum in terms of color just by using those two. And then there's also erasure, and that allows me to take away and reveal some lighter aspects. But the erasure is very important because it also speaks to this whole idea of scarring or removal. And when you remove, you also leave traces of what was there before. So the technique, the color, the complexity of the layers, all those lend to the concept that I'm trying to explore and think about. So the colors that you see are from nature.
Tony, I think we had a question up front here. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcia, is it on?
Yeah.
I'm so impressed with your work, and I'm so grateful to you for explaining it as carefully as you did. I have so many questions, but I'll confine myself to a couple. I have the feeling, and I wonder if you would talk about this, that you almost channel from somewhere else when you do your drawings, that you begin and then you're kind of the instrument of putting an idea or a concept on either paper or in some other material, and that you almost let yourself be guided by the work as it develops rather than you dictating how the work should go. And one final question, when you do three-dimensional things like this part, do you draw that out in 2 dimensions and then put it together, or do you kind of envision it are you blessed with 3-dimensional thinking, imaging, and then just kind of build from within? Thank you.
Thank you. When working with a project like this, in most cases, whomever it is that you're working with, in this case, the Drawing Institute will say, what are your ideas? This provides a structure where they can work from. Allows them to create a budget so that your project becomes possible. But within that structure, you're given a lot of freedom. The structure is meant to, at least it's an institution, guide everybody, give people an idea. But I was free to come here and just draw nothing. I could do, I could respond to the wall the way that I saw fit, So there was both structure and then there was also freedom within that structure to work with. I came up with a sketch for the network, what I thought in my mind it should be like in my little studio at home. I had visited the wall previously, but the wall is I don't even know how to describe it, but it's a completely different experience from drawing something in your studio, like a 2-dimensional. I was drawing this way, making my sketch, the wall is this way. So whatever I was doing, the wall responds completely differently to it. Yeah, you have your ideas, but the wall is the wall, So you come here and you are engaged with this 36 feet. 36 feet.
6 feet, it's 20.
How many feet?
I think it's 20. 6 meters. 6 meters.
6 meters. 6 meters, how many feet?
Like
20 feet.
Like 20 feet by?
It's about 10.
By 10,
Yeah.
Yeah, about there, yeah. So my sketch was about maybe 9 some inches, something very small. And I could measure my hand with my sketch. I could draw, measure it. But here I had to measure the wall with my body. I had to feel the space with my body. I had to move back and forth like that. And at every point in time, I had to always do that, position myself with the wall in terms of how to respond to it. And the sketch that I made would not possibly have translated to the wall. And I constantly had to remind myself that I'm here to draw. So I drew. I just drew. That was how. In terms of thinking about it three-dimensionally, and to respond to that, it was, of course, there's the platform, and then there's the wall itself, and then there's the sculptural element that I had to bring together to create one work. But the most important thing for me was the drawing, and how I could make the marks that the sketch carry that feeling of rawness that I had in the sketch onto the drawing itself, because that was what appealed to me most, not necessarily how complex it was, but that energy of the line and how to transfer that onto the wall. And once that was like the final layer. There are like several layers on top of that, with the watercolor technique that I spoke about in the beginning. You could see that with the pigment, it allows you to like layer, like over, creating this surface that spoke of struggle. At some time, my feet buckled under me quite a couple of times. So there was the beauty in there's kind of something about having a sketch and just transferring it onto the wall and just be at peace, like, okay, this is what, just stick it onto the wall. There was another thing about responding to what it was that I saw in real time and space, and that was what the drawing demanded, and that was what I had to do in order to get the drawing to where I wanted it to be. So I had to respond to the wall directly in real time and space, even if I had a guide, like the sketch, but yeah, that was what happened. Yeah, you're welcome.
Marcia, thank you so much. This is some really beautiful things were said. Yeah. I'm so pleased that we had an opportunity to welcome you back. We are at our time. We're going to be celebrating Marcia, though, so please stay with us. We'll have music and food outside, and if you haven't gotten the sense of how wonderfully generous Marcia is, she's going to be here celebrating with us. So if you have questions, please just ask her. She's here. So eat with us, drink with us, celebrate with us for the next hour or so. And really, Marcia, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today.